Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're back in War Thunder, and it's time to look at another argument for another aircraft to be put into the game, and this comes because of a lad called Tiffs. Now, Tiffs has created a suggestion on the War Thunder forums for the Hawker Hurricane Mk.IIC. There will be a link in the description for it, but let's just say it's one of the most comprehensive things I've ever seen when it's come to the forums and these types of things, basically asking, do you want this vehicle? Now, what we're going to do in this video is make a case for it using the article itself and also some personal opinion, but I just want to let you know this is where this idea came from. So if you want to go and give him some love, go and do it. As I said, link is in the description. So in the game right now, we have already a bunch of Hurricanes. We have the Hurricane Mark IIB, we have the Hurricane Mark IV, we even have the Sea Hurricane Mark 1C. But what makes the Mark IIC separate from the rest? Well, this was the actual most common Hurricane variant. There was 4,711 of them built, or converted from 2As and 2Bs. And this is something which happens at least a few times with specific vehicles from Gaijin, where they aren't able to get the actual most produced variant in, they're able to get the other produced ones. So that is the basic argument why the Hurricane Mark IIC should be in the game, because it was the most produced, it was the most used, and therefore why not have it? But let's go into the history of this machine first. So the use of the Hawker Hurricane 2A began in September 1940. The 2B in itself, February 1941, the 2B fighter bomber, the Hurry bomber, in May 1941, and then the 2C came around in April of 1941, with the 2D following it in March 1942, and the HE in September 1941. There was a few Hawker Hurricane 2Bs and 2Cs, which were fitted in 41 to 42, with the AI Mark IV or Mark V radar for night fighting, because you've got to remember, at this point, the Hurricane was seen as very much obsolete, especially with the Typhoon coming, the Spitfire around. It was one of those machines which, unfortunately, due to basically the technology at the time, just kind of fell out of favor. It didn't have enough power behind it. The guns itself were seen as lackluster, so they need to be upgraded. The general design of the aircraft was not as good as others which were flying around in 1941-42. So what the British did generally with these machines, such as the Hurricane, was try and find other roles for them. So therefore they would try them in fighter bomber roles, they would try them in night fighting roles, to see how they would do, compared to the normal roles which would actually be taken by the fighters, which were seen as the best. So therefore the Spitfire variants of the time, and then going forward with stuff like the Tempest and also the Griffon Spitz. So anyway, back to the night fighters. The fuselage radio rack, or the underwing pod, was used in place of drop tanks, and all Mark II variants served with UK-based squadrons, and also they served overseas. In 1941, in November, 25 Hawker Hurricane squadrons based in the Middle East and others in Malta, Iceland, and also the Soviet Union. So this is a machine which we also see in the Soviet tree. For the Soviets, we have a premium Hurricane, so why not have that kind of similar thing for the British? In the Middle East, there was about 200 Hurricanes, including 20 Mark 1s re-engined with the Merlin 20, and then they were modified with the TAC-R, which was the 1 camera and full armament, or the PR, which had 2 cameras and no armament, so obviously for reconnaissance missions. The Hurricane 2 squadrons also engaged in India and Burma from 1942 to 44. So once again, as I said, the British had a great tendency of, if an airframe was seen as not as good as some of its competitors, they would export it, they would change it into a fighter bomber, they would change it into a night fighter, basically just try and find a use for it, which is why you see it being used here. On top of all of this, if we look at the Hurricane 2 production in general in the UK, it totaled 8,676. So you had 451 Mark IIAs, 2,948 Mark IIBs, 4,711 Mark IICs, 296 Mark IIDs, and 270 Mk.IICs, and then also 100 Mark Is, which were converted to Mark IIAs by Rolls-Royce. So, on top of all of this, the UK squadrons having these Hawkers, and there was also several Commonwealth squadrons which flew the Hurricane alongside the RAF. So this included the RAAF, SAAF units in the Middle East, and also the good old Royal Canadian Air Force in the UK, which was used there to make sure that the RAF would have the strength it required in the battles it was going forward. In India itself, there were 7 squadrons of the IAF which flew Hurricanes, Mark IIB, Cs and 4s, from June 1942. They used about 300 aircraft transferred from the RAF stocks, and then following on from the Mark I supplies, Turkey also received 38 Hurricane 2Bs and 91 2Cs, of which 44 equipped for REIS. If you don't know what that is, then it's basically reconnaissance work. And 2 squadrons of the Royal Egyptian Air Force flew ex-RAF Hawker Hurricanes with some U's and also some 1s from 41 to 45. So you can see that the Hurricane was used a lot. Not just the 2C, but basically every variant of the Hurricane. The main thing to focus on in this, though, is the fact that the 2C was the most common of them all. Now, throwing in a little bit of a personal history for me, during the last 15 years, when I've been really invested in World War II, not happenings, I don't think, but World War II history, when my grandfather started talking to me about the Battle of Britain and all of that stuff, the 2 aircraft that I always picked out was the Hurricane and the Halifax. And the reason for this is whenever I read about the British forces, it always talked about the Spitfire and the Lancaster, and I kind of wondered why, because whenever I looked at statistics, the Hurricane and the Halifax were the 2 machines which did the legwork compared to the Lancaster and the Spitfire. But because the Spitfire and the Lancaster were seen as better machines, everybody remembers them. It's very similar to how in America people remember the B-17, the Flying Fortress, but don't remember the Liberator, the B-24, even though the B-24 did a hell of a lot of the work. So the Hurricane has always held a special place for me in history, in my learnings, and also in War Thunder as well. It's one of my favorite aircraft in War Thunder, so there's definitely a little bit of bias going along with this, but it's always nice to see, new machines available. So, as I said, Mark IIC was around, and basically the idea of the Mark IIC was to create a cannon-armed Hurricane, which was originally carried out as early as 35. So a lot of people say that, Britain didn't think about, cannons for a hell of a long time. They really didn't like them. There was no use in them. They believed in the 7.7, and that's kind of true from the pilot's point of view and also from the people above them. But once they started looking at and seeing designs coming at them, especially when they looked at the bombers and also when they looked at some of the all-metal machines which were coming around at the time, they realized that firepower was something that they would require. Now, unfortunately, in the Hurricane, one of the issues it had was the engine power compared to the weight of the added guns, but luckily eventually that was sorted out. So at the time, the weight of the cannon reduced performance too much, so as I said before, and the contract for a cannon-armed aircraft went to Westland Whirlwind. Good old Westland Whirlwind. Oh my days. Work on the idea resumed in about 39, when Mark I was converted to carry an Oerlikon 20mm cannon under each wing, so very similar to how you see the Mark IV in-game. And then finally, in 1940, there was a prototype which was built with 2 20mm Hispano Sousa cannons inside each wing. And by the way, if you want to see pictures, as I said, go to the article, it's all written out there for you. The Hawker Hurricane 2C, it first flew on the 6th of February 1941, and it entered service in late spring of 1941. So the prototype itself went very well on the 6th of February to be able to be put into service so quickly compared to a lot of other aircraft at the time. But then you've also got to remember that during the war, a lot of these processes, we'll just say, were quickened up quite significantly. By the end of the year, 18 overseas squadrons were equipped with the 2C, and in 1941 both the Mark IIB and 2C were provided the racks for carrying two 250-pounders or 500-pound bombs, or alternatively two droppable fuel tanks, and they were both equipped with tropical equipment for service overseas. So we're not just talking about a single aircraft here. What we're also talking about is the 2C Trop, if they ever feel like adding it in. I mean, they've already done some Mark V Spitfire tropical versions, and also the G2 tropical version. Is there a requirement for a 2C tropical version in the form of a Hurricane? How about we just focus on the 2C for now? So, the Hurricane was not really a success as a night fighter. As I said, there was a lot of aircraft thrust into this role, and because they unfortunately either fell out of mainline service or wanted to see if they'll be better at this. It proved very suitable as a night intruder, with squadrons like Number 1, where it was used with great effect by Flight Commander Karel Kutelwasher, I hope I said that right, and Squadron Leader James McLatten, and Number 43, both of which were based in Tangmere at the time of conducting such operations. One of the 43 Squadron's night intruder pilots, Harry Lee, had this to say about it. The Hurricane Mark IIC was a splendid aircraft for the job in hand. It had range with its two 45-gallon wing drop tanks, excellent armament with 4 20mm cannon, and it was tough. Solid aircraft that could withstand a great deal of punishment and still survive. This later point was proved at the Dieppe raid, when we suffered several from ground fire and all but 2 aircraft returned, of which 5 sustained varying degrees of damage. One of these, you would wonder how it managed to stay in the air. So even though some of the pilots had good things to say about it, the unfortunate thing was it still had issues with power to weaponry ratios, which is something that a lot of later Hurricanes struggled with, and was an unfortunate thing which was carried on with a lot of other British aircraft. So the 2C itself was fitted with 4 20mm cannons, 2 in either wing, in place of the 8 or 12 Browning machine guns on the earlier Marks. The cannons were French Hispano-Suiza HS-404 guns, and it was immediately obvious that a Hurricane was a 2C because its cannons protruded so far out of the leading edge of the wings. So basically, if you take a Mark IIB that we have in game, compare it to a Sea Hurricane Mark 1C, it will be very, very obvious which one you're fighting against by being able to look at the wings. You won't even have to look at the camouflage and get that close for it. The overall length of the guns was about 8 foot 2.5 inches, and the recoil springs stood out along the barrels. These protruding cannon had rubber covers like oversized condoms, so that it was a simple matter for ground crew to see if a returning pilot had used his weapons. On Number 1 Squadron's intruder aircraft, the cannon's ammunition consisted of equal quantities of high explosive, or HE, and ball ammunition, which would be 20mm ball or 0.787 inch. The former exploded on impact to create a hole in the enemy's aircraft, and the latter was a solid steel missile designed to pierce the plating of the German planes. Hopefully when this gets added into game, we would have a little bit more options than just HE and ball. Ball generally doesn't do a lot of damage unless you're at the really low tiers, and to be honest, this thing won't be at the tiers I'm thinking of, around the 101.3 area. This will be a little bit higher than that, so the ball ammunition will become kind of useless in its state. They alternated in the belt, and at a muzzle velocity of about 2,880 feet per second, it did not take them long to reach their targets. Many think of the fighter aircraft of the Second World War as having a considerable volume of ammunition, and certainly the movies give that impression. If you've ever watched Battle of Britain, even Battle of Bulge, with the tanks that they had, and the reliability of the tanks is something that's kind of funny. But if you watch any war movie, you do have to take into account that they never show you the ammunition counter unless a specific hero has run out of ammunition and has to crash his plane into something or something ridiculous like that. So the available firing time of a Hurricane armed with cannons was even less than one for machine guns, which is, as you know in game, the one with machine guns is kind of low already, so having cannons may be a bit of an issue. Although of course there was much more power in the punch, so you're basically burst firing, hoping to annihilate a target pretty quickly and then go back to base. The 2Cs carried a total of 364 rounds of ammunition, 91 per cannon, so not a lot, we'll say. And at an approximate rate of fire of about 600 to 650 rounds per minute, this was long enough for about 9 seconds of firing, so every second had to count, and a typical burst would only be between 1 and 3 seconds. So very similar to something like a Mk.IIC, if you want to think about that. Slightly better than it, but yeah, as I said, you've got to really control the ammunition that you're using. Like all fighter armaments, the 2C's cannons were aligned to focus at a point some way ahead of the aircraft. The original Hurricane had its machine guns aligned to convergence at a point of 650 yards ahead, but later the distance was reduced to 400 yards, obviously after pilot experience. And then the insistence of squadron leader P.J.H. Hallahan, the commanding officer of No. 1 Squadron until May 1940, the alignment was further reduced to 250 yards. So as you can see, getting shorter and shorter every time, so you have to get closer and closer to the target to be able to be accurate. So successful night intruder pilots would position themselves behind the enemy, so as to escape observation, and a little above or below them, because obviously that would help with targeting, and they would also be able to hit the fuselage instead of just rack attack tack into the rudder and tail of the plane. Hitting the fuselage meant that you could do the most damage to the aircraft, and also there's a lot of juice in there, whether it be bombs, whether it be people, whether it be just general structure. If you can separate both areas of the aircraft, obviously it's going to go down, and it's the biggest, chunkiest part to shoot at, which at night is something you have to focus on. And the usual mode of attack would be to tuck in close and fire at a distance of about 100 or 200 yards, so incredibly close to them. The use of the cannon could be colourful, as Godfrey Ball of 43 Squadron recalls. So when shooting up trains, the cannon shells would ricochet from both the engine strikes and from the permanent way if you undershot when aiming at the guard's van, and looked remarkably like flak, blue, red, green and white. It almost seemed at times as if I were going to fly into my own bullets. Well, there you go, Godfrey. I've never met a Godfrey who hasn't been a little bit eccentric, though. And may I just say, Godfreys overall are just wonderful people. I just want to say. But yeah, overall, what we have here is another Hurricane variant. There is also part of the article which goes into a premium variant that the creator would like to see. Me personally, I would prefer just to first of all see the stock aircraft in the game and then a premium version of it with a skin. One of the things I talked about before is the perfect premium, in my opinion, is a machine which is able to have a complete copy of it in the tree, and this version would be one of that. It would basically just be a reskinned Mark IIC with not a lot different, but slight differences to make it unique to the person. But yeah, what are you getting out of the Spitfire, the Hurricane Mark IIC? Something very similar to what you find in the Sea Hurricane Mark IC, with slightly better performance, but even if it is similar to what we see in the Mark IC, something you do have to realize is this machine was the most produced, I suppose would be the way to put it, or most made. Basically, it was the most abundant one out of it. It also has access to secondary armament, so in game the 500 pounders would be incredibly useful against the ground. With access to ground target belts, it may be useful in ground realistic as well, and on top of that, it would just be another fun Hurricane to fly. And as a person who has enjoyed every single Hurricane apart from maybe the Mark IC, I would love to see it. I really would. Any more British aircraft, whether it be heavy bombers, whether it be specific fighters, I'm always down for. So thank you for creating this. As I said, once again, there is a link in the description to it, and I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time.